Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Agnius. Thank you for being here for the Global Power Platform Bootcamp Polish edition. Um, and I'm here to tell you about a way in which you might actually be able to avoid using RPA for scraping certain web pages where you might have previously thought you absolutely need RPA, but you could actually do it via a better approach. That's exposed API. Now, before I do that, I'll just give a quick shout out to the Polish Power Platform community, which I absolutely love. There's 4 user groups and there's a very active Discord server. I'd love to be part of that one because it seems nice, but it's all in Polish and I don't really speak Polish, unfortunately. But for all of you who are actually Polish speakers, feel free to join that. It seems quite active and great in there. And I also want to give a great shout out to the event that's actually coming up in June this year, the European Power Platform Conference, which is pretty much the biggest Power Platform conference you can get into, apart from the one in Vegas. And it's amazing. I was there last year in Dublin, and I'm absolutely going to be there in Brussels this year as well. And if you don't have a ticket yet, there's a chance to win it if you scan the code or buy it at a discount if you use the code Baltic. The conference agenda has already been announced. It's great. It's full of amazing speakers with great content. There are also a couple of events coming up in Poland as well. The Collab Days Poland in Warsaw in April is actually quite soon. I'll actually be there running a workshop on Power Automate Desktop. So if you're there, ping me and we can chat. The Baltic Summit, that's also great. That's in Gdynia, most likely. The agenda hasn't been announced yet, but I probably will be there at least as an attendee. So if you're there, also ping me. Anyway, so I'm Agnius. I run an agency that specializes in process improvement consultancy and automation. I'm fairly knowledgeable about Power Automate, RPA in general, and well, certain beverages, alcoholic beverages, but that's not the point today. Anyway, and the topic today is using exposed APIs instead of scraping web page user interfaces. The agenda is pretty straightforward. I'll share a few slides where I'll take you through the basics of what exposed APIs are and why it makes sense to use them. And then I'll switch to a demo where I'll show you how to actually find and reverse engineer an exposed API on a page, how to test it, and how to implement that in Power Automate. And we'll have some Q&A. So the reason I talk about in general is because, well, web automation is a rather frequent task in RPA. Well, we get to automate web pages, third-party web pages, quite frequently. We need to either scrape data from it, we might need to put data into it, but it's a very frequent task. It's great if the website actually has an API available, a properly documented API as an extension to their service, but it's absolutely not always the case. And when it's not, then we kind of resort to automating it via the user interface where RPA excels. But this obviously comes with significant challenges. First of all, it's generally less stable to automate a user interface because it depends on things like the machine it runs on, the browser we use. It depends on loading speed, it depends on the actual elements on the web page and their positions changing or them being blocked by a pop-up or something like that. It can also be quite difficult to do, especially for heavily JavaScript-infused pages, which are built to look nice and feel nice to the user. They focus on the user experience, but they're absolutely a hell to automate most of the time. And these user interfaces, they change quite frequently. And even if some of those changes are not even visible to the human eye, if they mess with the overall structure of the page, they can easily break the RPA flow when the flow relies on the element's position within the page, within the overall HTML structure of the page, etc. And obviously, no web page owner will ever notify you or anyone else in advance about a planned change to their user interface, because, well, why would they? They don't need that. The user interface is only designed to be interacted with by a user. not a robot. And as such, you will never be able to prepare for changes like that. You will only find out about a change after your flow starts failing. And then you'll essentially have to fight fires. Obviously, when we do that, and we have to use RPA, right? When it comes to Power Automate, it's desktop flows. Now, I love desktop flows. There's plenty of applications for it. I use it all the time. But even with all that said, I still prefer using cloud flows whenever possible. And that's because of various reasons. First of all, desktop flows requires extra resources. They need a machine to run on. They potentially need a more expensive license. And then they're kind of less efficient. First of all, because there's some latency and lag when it comes to connectivity between the cloud and the desktop. So if we actually want to run a desktop flow from the cloud, it will actually, it will take a few minutes for the desktop flow to start after being triggered and then to end. And then there is concurrency policy limitations, only allowing one desktop flow to run on a single machine at the same time. So it's less efficient. As such, I would usually prefer using cloud flows whenever possible and applicable. However, cloud flows do not actually have any way of interacting with user interfaces for obvious reasons. So whenever we think we need to scrape a user interface, we kind of lock ourselves to using RPA to do it. But there's usually a better way, which comes in the form of exposed APIs. I call them exposed because they're essentially, well, they're not documented. They're the sorts of APIs that are actually running in the background, and the user interface or the web page is actually built to call those API endpoints on the server in the backend to pull and fetch the data from the server and display it via the user interface. So even if a web page doesn't actually have a proper documented API as an extension to their service, most pages actually have APIs running in the background to fetch the data. But they're not really documented. They're not designed to be consumed publicly apart from via the user interface, but they are actually publicly accessible and available and can consumed by the general public as long as they know how to do it. That's why I call them exposed, but that's really just the term I came up with. Now, if you've ever used APIs instead of using user interfaces, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that it's a much more efficient approach. They work much faster. We don't need to rely on the browser at all. We don't load the page itself. We don't load irrelevant assets such as images, videos, ads, etc. So it usually runs much faster. It usually returns the data in a much more structured format because that's the way the data is actually stored in the server, usually in some JSON format or an XML or something like that. It's built like that so the page itself can parse it easily when it fetches it to display it in the user interface. So it's usually much easier to actually parse it in a flow as well. It's much more stable because these endpoints change much less frequently than the user interface. And even if they do change, the changes don't always break the flows because, even if more features are added, more endpoints are added, or more data is added to an endpoint you're already using, that doesn't necessarily break your flow because, as long as the endpoint itself works and it returns the data you expect it to return, your flow is good to go. Even if something is added or removed, it does not necessarily break anything. So what this means is that if we actually go with this approach, it results in significantly less support and maintenance needed when the flow is live. And finally, it's cloud friendly, meaning we can actually run this in cloud flows. We do not need to use RPA. Of course, we could still do it. We could still invoke a web service via desktop flows if we wanted to. If we wanted to stick to a free version of Power Automate Desktop and do it in there, we're free to use it. It would still be much more efficient than scraping a user interface. But we no longer absolutely have to. If we want to, we can put this in a cloud flow and avoid using desktop flows entirely. Now, obviously, not everything is fine and dandy when it comes to exposed APIs. There are some downsides to this approach. First of all, APIs in general is more complex than automating a user interface, especially to citizen developers who are maybe not familiar with consuming APIs. Even if it's a documented API, they may not necessarily know how to actually read the documentation, how to interpret it. They might not necessarily know which requests they need to send to get the actual response they expect, or how to actually parse the response afterwards. When they know how to, how to manually click through a user interface to get the results they want, they will also know what they need to automate. Even if the user interface is a pain to automate, they might still stick to that. But when it comes to exposed APIs, there is no documentation. So that means we actually need to reverse engineer the API to figure out how it works, which adds to the complexity, which means that it's a task that most citizen developers will not actually be able to handle in the first place at all. Also, the fact that there is no documentation means that we don't really know all of the responses possible, meaning we need to do more tests. More time and effort needs to be put in so that we can actually figure out everything we need to know about it and put in appropriate handling for the possible responses of the endpoint, which means that more investment upfront to build a flow like that. But as mentioned previously, this will usually pay off in much less time needed for support and maintenance when the flow is live. And finally, since this is not a documented API, it's not really a service provided to the general public. No owner of such an API will ever notify anyone about upcoming changes. So the same way as with changes to the user interface, we won't in advance. Why would usually the organization or person owning the API server owns the web page, so they know what they need to change, and that's it. So we will never know when that happens, and we only know that we need to make restore flows when they start failing. So we will still fight fire, but these fires will be significantly less frequent because, as mentioned, these changes are much less likely, and they will not always break our flows, unlike with user interface.
Chwilę poczekajmy jeszcze. Spróbuję.
Sorry, when did I break off? I'm back. What was the last thing you heard from me?
Hello.
A couple of minutes ago.
No, sorry. It was about complexity of the endpoint of the exposed APIs and.
Oh my God! Seriously?
No.
Sorry about that.
It was not so far ago.
Yeah, right. Okay, but I actually went quite ahead without noticing I was off. Sorry. Anyway, so I'll just.
Yeah, if you please reshare.
Yeah, I'll reshare.
We will tell you.
That's the hotel thing in here. Anyway, I've switched. Yeah, I've switched to my mobile phone. That should actually be more reliable, at least. Right. So I was on this line. Oops. Sorry,
Yeah,
not this one.
Indeed.
I was on this one, right?
You were mentioning the points, no documentation, more testing needed, and still fighting fire. And this is when I think we lost you. So the last point.
So you heard the fact that we would still need to fight fires because no one will ever notify us about changes to these APIs, right?
Indeed, yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we would still be fighting fires, but these fires would be much less frequent because, well, as mentioned previously, we would the changes themselves are less frequent to these API endpoints than they are to user interfaces, and they're also, even if they happen, they are less likely to actually break a flow. So, even though we would still be fighting fires, they would usually be much less frequent. So it still makes a lot of sense to use this approach. Right, and so with this, I actually am through the basics, and it's time to switch to my demo, which I had already started before I figured out I had lost you. So let's go back to this. And right, so for the purpose of the demo, I went with, well, I thought I would build a flow that fetches me some travel options for a holiday trip, right? And the reason I went with that, even though there are plenty of other sites that could potentially do, could potentially have exposed APIs available, various web shops, various job boards, and all sorts of other sites. I went with the easy way of travel sites because I know for a fact most travel agencies actually have their APIs exposed to their web page. And the reason I know that is because I've built flows in the past where, I had to scrape prices for certain travel agencies from their competitor websites so that they could compare them against their own pricing. And in 9 out of 10 cases, I would find that there is an exposed API available on the competitor side, making my life much easier. So I went with Hays Travel, which is a reasonably well-known travel site in the UK, I think. I've never used them in the past, to be honest, but I just wanted an English site for the international audiences. But all of these sites are generally the same. The sequence of steps needed to find a trip is actually the same with all of them. So you should be able to follow what I'm doing here when I start. If you don't understand what I'm doing, it just really shows that you desperately need a vacation. Anyway, so if I wanted to find a trip, if I wanted to automate this, I'd go through search holidays, and there's a sequence of steps I need to do. I'd select a departure point, a destination, a date for my trip, the duration of it, and then the passengers, and click on search. And it's quite straightforward, but it's usually a pain to automate, especially with the user interfaces like this. There is a drop down that's not really a drop down, and then there's checkboxes to click, etc. So the first thing I would do in a case like this, I would check for an exposed API. And the correct way to do it is to open the developer tools on your browser. There are 2 ways to do it. You can either right-click anywhere on the page and click on Inspect, or just send an F12 key, and that will open up the developer tools. This will work regardless of the browser. Even though I'm using Edge over here, you can do it on Chrome, Firefox, or whatever you're using. This will work the same way anyway. Now, the developer tools will pop up, but the tab that we need is the network tab over here that actually shows all of the network traffic happening on the sites as we navigate through it. The important thing here, first of all, is to enable this checkbox, the preserve log checkbox, so that the logs actually get preserved as we refresh or navigate out. As you'll see, when I click on search, it will actually open a different site. So we actually need that to see previous logs. Right, so if I refresh this, you'll see plenty of stuff happening over here. Lots and lots of various requests. And by the way, sorry about the screen being quite narrow. I'm on a laptop in a hotel, remember? Anyway, so we have some images being loaded, some scripts running, some fonts loading, etc. All sorts of stuff we don't really care about. So the way to not really get lost in the clutter here is to filter them by type. And the correct type we need is the so-called fetch XHR requests, which will significantly narrow down the requests that are in here. There will still usually be a few, but they will be easier to navigate and find the correct one. Right, so now that we've got this open, I'll go through the sequence and you can see what's happening over here. Right, so first of all, I'll select an airport. Let's go with all of the London airports, for instance. I'll select a destination, so Spain, for example, a date, Mid-April. 7 nights should be fine. That's usually the minimum for a proper vacation anyway. And let's go with the default because let's just do a holiday for me and my wife without the kids for a change. Anyway, this will result 90 holidays, and we'll list all of the results with some options, right? You probably have seen this. Right, and now, but what you have probably seen was that there were several new requests popping up as I was clicking through the sequence. And now if I click on one of these, and let's just expand this a bit, I can see some data. And I can see the headers being sent in here, the URL and the fact that it's a post request. I can see a payload. If there's a request body, there will be a payload tab over here. If there is no body for the request, this tab will not even be visible. And then I can see a preview and the actual response over here. This will usually be a JSON response, might be an XML if it's a SOAP request, but that's quite rare actually. And in this case, this is the request that was actually sent to fetch the airports when I was selecting them from the dropdown. So this actually returns all of the airports, right? The next one returns all of the countries. The next one is something from the date picker, right? It returns the months available, the dates available on the first month that was shown, the February. If I clicked through March as well, and then the April. Available durations as well. The available options for traveling people within a room, right? That's also, and then that's where I clicked the search button. Some other requests which are irrelevant. I don't really know what these do. I don't care, to be honest. And then this one is the one that actually returns the offers. So yeah, 90 results as shown over here. And then there's an array of objects, which has some images over here. But then if we scroll down, I can see that the name is Ona Ogisaka Garden, or whatever you pronounce that. And that's this one. It's in Denia, Spain, Costa Blanca. So that's this one. And then further down, we get the others. All right, so this is essentially what we need. It's a request that returns the search results for our query. And now that I've found it, I can try to mimic this in a Power Automate flow. But before I actually do it, the recommended approach would actually be to test it in a testing suite, in an API testing suite like Postman or Insomnia, for instance. I'll go with Insomnia in this case because I prefer the user interface. And yeah, so I'll try to create a new HTTP request in here. And then I'll come back here and see the headers. I'll copy the URL. And I'll note that it's a post request. All right, so I'll paste it over here, do a post request. Right, I'll come back here. There's a payload, right? So there's a body, pretty large one. I'll add that over here as a JSON body. So this is a JSON body anyway, even though it's formatted quite strange. It's probably it's like this because simply, well, the endpoint is built to parse it like this. There are some new lines being added. Is essentially a single string, even though, you know, if we were to parse it, it is an actual JSON thing. Anyway, and if I send this now, I'll actually get an error that says it's missing an authorization header, right? So there is some sort of an authentication sequence in this. So in some cases, we might actually need to send extra requests to authenticate. You know, maybe just hit the home page to get a session ID or a cookie or something. In some cases, when we actually authenticate via the user interface, we might actually need to send the credentials or something. But ironically, in this particular case, it simply has a bearer token over here that's static. I've actually tested this. It works. It's exactly the same regardless of the browser I use, even on different machines on different dates, it stays the same. So I can just copy this out, and you know, even though it does kind of need an authorization sequence, it's not really a sequence. It's just a static thing. So I'll just add a bearer token over here, paste this, and if I send this, I get the response, the same response that we've just seen. Sorry, is there... Was that a question to me, or was that someone not,
I will
forgetting
take
to
care
be
about
muted?
it.
So, okay, cool.
Just continue. I will mute them.
Okay, cool. Anyway, so now that we found that request that I could actually, just send in and put this into a Power Automate flow, and coming back to the actual body of the request, we can see the parameters in here that we actually used during the search. So there is the airport codes for the London airports I selected. There is a destination country ID, 60 stands for Spain in this case. There's the duration, 7 nights. There's the array of rooms with a single room with 2 adults in there. And then there is the departure date. In some cases, you might find that the parameters are actually encoded in the URL itself, and then there's no body. That happens. There are cases like that. It's usually the case with GET requests. Post requests will usually require some sort of a body that then gets processed at the endpoint, and then they return it. So in this particular case, we actually send the parameters in the body instead of the URL. And so I could potentially now build this into a Power Automate flow. But, I'm thinking that, why not make it a bit more dynamic and maybe mimic some of the other requests as well, so that I can maybe get the airport code as well via the API, because, well, perhaps they will start servicing more airports in the future, or maybe I want a flow where I can actually select, provide the departure city as inputs so that it gets them dynamically for me. So in order to do that, I'll just rename this so it doesn't get lost. It's get offers, right? And then I'll go back here and find the other request, the first one that actually returned the airports, right? I'll check it out. I can see it's actually the same URL for all of them, which is not always the case. Obviously, the most websites will actually have different APIs for the different responses. But in this particular case, they actually have a single endpoint, and then the endpoint handles the payload. That's probably why the payload is funky like that. But anyway, so all I need to do in this case is just copy the entire payload over here. I'll just duplicate this request, call it airports, paste the body, because the URL and the bearer token and everything is the same. And I'll just run this and it gets me the airports. Cool. And then, if I'm going all in with being dynamic and all, then why not also get the countries as well? So I'll do the exact same thing with the countries. All right, so I'll duplicate this. Get destinations. Paste the body over here. And you'll actually notice that in the search query, we already have destination, the departure points actually provided as inputs to this, and the reason why that is the case is because when I was tracking the network traffic, I selected the airports first, and then I selected the countries. And as such, the airports was already provided as the search query. It doesn't necessarily, well, it's not really required and it's not really needed. So I'll just delete this and I'll just run this request, and then I get the countries. Right, so I got these 3 requests where I get the airports, the destinations, and the offers. And as I run the offers, I can easily build a flow that gets the airports and destinations first, and then use the dynamic content from them in the body for this one. And then for the others, I can just put in input parameters to my flow, for instance, for the departure date, the number of adults, or the duration of my trip. One more thing to note when reverse engineering APIs like this is that it sometimes has a pagination functionality. So in this particular case, if I collapse this, you'll see that it only has 25 results in here, even though it says there's 90 in total. And that's a sort of a pagination functionality that's frequently applied to search results in travel agencies and web shops, etc. If I were to scroll down to the bottom of the page, I'd see there is a load more button. In some cases, there might be a panel to navigate between the pages. If I click on this, there will be a new request being generated, which will generate a further response with following pages, again, 25 of them. And it will be the same URL, the same method and everything else. It's only the payload that actually differs. And what we'll see is it has a parameter that says take 25, which is why it actually returns 25 items. And it has another parameter that has a start index equaling 25. Whereas in our original request, what we had was, where was that? Right, here's the start index says 0. So the first page starts at 0, takes 25. If we want a further page, we increment the start index and then take the next 25 items. And if we were to, go to something like 100, right, it would just run this and return an empty array. It wouldn't actually return an error. So that actually works. We could potentially build a loop that handles this by just, incrementing the start index on each iteration and, just parsing the responses like that, which is something that we might be forced in some cases to do, but you should always challenge this fact because it's not really always a fact. In some cases, for instance, I've seen pages that return 10 results by default, but then you could actually increase that to 50 maximum, which, if you try more, it will actually return an error saying that 50 is the maximum. But then, if you have more results than 50, you would still need to build in pagination, but at least you would need 5 times less requests to send and parse afterwards. So that's still more efficient. In this particular case, I actually found that I can do 1000 and it would still not break. It would take a few more seconds to actually load the response. It takes 3 seconds when I'm not actually streaming, so it's a bit of connectivity things, but it actually returns all 90 results for me without actually breaking. So that's a way to avoid doing pagination and loops in my flow. I can just do a single request. And now that I've figured all of this out, I can put that into a flow. So I'll switch back to the browser. I've actually already built a few flows because if I hadn't, it would take much more time than we have for the session. So I've already built them, but I'll show you how they work. I've built 3, one for each request. So first of all, there is the one for getting airports. And what it does is pretty straightforward. I have a manual trigger with a departure city as an input parameter so that I can get it dynamically. I have an HTTP action with a post request, the same URL, the same body we just used. I added the authentication header with a raw type, a bearer token. I have some, parse JSON action. I have a compose action that will just run an XPath query to get me the codes for the airports where the name actually matches the country I want. And then I'll return it as a join string so that I can pass it back to a parent flow. If I test this with London, for example, this will run. And all right, so the response over here is these very same airport objects. When I compose it, it returns the codes for the London airports, and then I return that as a single string to my parent flow. It's pretty straightforward. I then have another flow that does almost exactly the same for the destinations. I have a destination country as an input field. I have the get destinations request, which is exactly the same as the previous one, but the body is the one for destinations. I parse it. I have another XPath query, which is almost the same as well. It returns the IDs of the countries where the name matches for my input parameter. And then I return the first ID because I only want one of them. Should only match one anyway. And if I test this with Spain, this will result in, right, so the response is, the one for countries. we've already seen. The compose will return 60 as the ID, and then yeah, I'll just return this. And that's it. And finally, I have the main flow, which is designed to actually incorporate everything. So, right, another manual trigger with more parameters. Obviously, I need the destination country and the departure city for the child flows. But then I also added a departure date, a duration, and the number of adults for the parameters of the request, and also a maximum price for some filtering for the fun of it. All right, I then call the child flows to get the airports and the destinations. And then I run a request. Again, the same URL, the same authentication, and the body is different, but now I pass the parameters in, the airport codes returned by the child flow. I convert the country ID to an integer because that's the way it needs to be passed into this body. And then I use the duration, the number of adults, and the departure date from the input field. I then parse it. I then use a filter array to filter by the price so that it returns something that's within my budget. And if there are any available offers, I'll create an HTML table and send it to myself via email. So if I test this now manually with Spain as the destination country, with the same date we used for the test, 7 nights, me and my wife only, London, and let's say £800, pretty reasonable for 7 nights, right? And I run this, and what I get back, again, the child flows run, they return the airport codes and 60 as the country ID. I run this request, which returns a response that's fairly similar to us by now. Okay, it actually returned 82. I wonder why that has actually changed. I may have passed in an incorrect parameter. Did I pass in? Oh, I selected one adult for some reason. Okay. Anyway, so apparently less hotels available when I'm traveling alone. Probably more options will actually fit into £800 then. Anyway, then filter them out. And then I get an HTML table that looks like this. And I send it to myself via email, which I should have received by now. Right, it's over there. It looks somewhat like this. Yeah, much more than I was getting when I was testing on 2 people. But yeah, still works perfectly fine. And that's pretty much all there is for the demo. I'll switch back to the slides now. And there are a few key takeaways for this. First of all, whenever you actually need to automate a web user interface for whatever reason, always challenge the fact on whether or not you do really need to automate the user interface. Check whether there's an API available. First of all, a documented one. If there isn't one, then check via the developer tools on your browser on whether there's an exposed API available. When you do that, make sure you preserve the logs and you filter the correct type of the request so you don't get lost in the clutter. When you find the request that you want, test it via an appropriate testing suite, whichever you prefer. It really is a matter of preference. Insomnia, Postman, there are actually more of them available on there. If you're familiar with any of them, feel free to use whatever works for you. Then challenge every argument value, play around with them, whether they're in the URL or the body of the request. Try out what's possible. Don't hard code them, use them dynamically. Also, if possible, if there is a pagination functionality on the endpoint, challenge it, check it if you can actually avoid it or at least reduce the number of iterations you need. And then when you actually know it works and when you know how it works, only then put it into a Power Automate flow. Whether a desktop flow or a cloud flow, doesn't really matter. Whatever you prefer. The important thing is then you actually have a choice of where to put it. And that's that. I would really like you to rate this session, because this is one of the first times I'm actually speaking at a tech event, and I'm also one of the very first time actually delivering this session. So if you have any constructive feedback, whether positive or negative, it would really help me improve. So please do that. And now it's time for questions.
Yes, we were so impressed about your session, but we haven't had time to put any questions in the chat. So probably there are many questions, and I have enabled the microphone. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any. From my perspective, I really appreciate your session because I have never had such a nice explanation of what is behind the scene of this, developer tool on web browser, and how to find actually the correct calls so we can use them. So now it will be much more, I will be using it much better than before.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It's something I've been using for quite a while, but whenever I chat about this in the communities on Discord or LinkedIn as well, it's something that not very many people are aware of, even though it's something that's kind of just become a common sense thing for me. It's the first thing I do whenever I need to hit a web page. So I hadn't really realized it's not common knowledge until like a year ago, and then I thought, yeah, it might make sense to maybe spread the word around that this is a possibility and how to actually do it.
Very good idea. Any questions from audience? Feel free to speak up.
Yes, I have a question. I'm a part of that. I'm really impressed with it. It will be so helpful for me now to looking for interesting travel offers. But I needed to just build this flow, and I am just curious about it. When you build the flow in Power Automate, is it possible that I can also get not only from one website, but it means that I needed to build as well as many child flows if I, for example, want to, I don't know, compare 3 websites that makes so many flows? Or is it possible to, I don't know, to create some kind of variables and to get APIs for this 3 website, for example?
Yeah, well, you could probably, well, thank you. That's actually a great question. You could do it in sort of variables and maybe put them in some sort of a list or a data table or something like that, and then just loop through that. But you would need to be aware that each website will essentially have a different API, and they will almost always be different. And while some of those fields in a Power Automate flow are actually editable, and you can just send a variable value in them for the URL, for instance, or the body, you could easily push these to a Dataverse table or a SQL database or something, or whatever, and then retrieve them. But some of them are not, and for instance, the method of the request, where we need to select either a post or a GET request or something like that, those are not really editable, and you would probably need to build a switch case or a condition or something like that into your flow that just kind of checks which type of request you need to send, so that you could put different HTTP actions inside them based on the type you want. Because some of them are not really configurable as variables, some of those fields, but some are. But then you would still need to also parse the response in different ways. You would probably also need the create HTML table action that I've used, for instance, to actually return those. To me, that would probably also be different for each case. It would make it for a much more complex flow, obviously, but it could probably be possible to build it into a single flow. It would just be very much bigger. But yes, essentially the idea is that you will usually have to kind of handle each different web page individually, unless you can find one, one API that actually pulls out data from various sites already for you. Like for instance, if I'm looking for a flight, the way I found a flight to Hamburg this time, I went to skyscanner.net or something like that. That's a site that already scrapes other pages, right? And I could hit that most likely via an exposed API to pull it from them, and they handle the part where they pull stuff from the other sites. So that's potentially something you might want to look into if you want to compare several different sites.
Oh yeah, that was very, very complex. I think that's a project for whole year. But thank you very much. Very, very nice explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. And any other questions? I have one.
Yes, I have one.
Okay, go on.
Agnes, do you consider to maybe do some practices with that kind of approach to the application? Like, I don't know, maybe do part of this solution with some kind of team? Because it's, it's quite useful.
What exactly do you mean, as in like building that as a service thing, or
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that could potentially be the case, but that's, building a product that scrapes other websites is, yeah, it's a thing that could be done, obviously. We would just need to host it somewhere, and that's pretty straightforward. Just probably need to figure out what sites make sense to be scraped, and then it's possible. Yeah, but I'm guessing, there are certain products that are already using this approach. For instance, we have locally where I'm from in Lithuania, there's a page called Pricer that essentially calls, returns prices from web shops and compares them, on certain items that you look for. So essentially, if you search for a certain item that you want to buy, and it returns you the list of prices on the item from different web shops. So it essentially uses the same technology in the background. It scrapes the web pages, the web shops via their exposed APIs. That's an existing product that you could potentially, use or build if you don't have one for your market.
Yeah.
That's doable, obviously. Just needs to be hosted somewhere. You need to build a web page around it, because usually people will use a web page to actually do that. It's just that, they will only need to use one instead of using 6 or 7 to compare all of the prices. So that's still a thing that makes it, not compelling to a user. It could potentially be as a connector kind of a thing in the Power Platform as well, if you wanted it. You could easily build a custom connector with or based on an exposed API. And then publish it. But that's that's risky, because if the owner of the service actually notices that you're actually using building a product on top of their exposed API that it's not really built to be a product, it might just change the API, and you might have to kind of keep fixing it so that the users are actually happy and so on. So that it's possible, but there are risks associated with it, with lots of support actually needed when you publish it to lots of people.
Okay, it sounds very challenging, and I think that it's maybe too hard.
No, well, it's doable. It's worth a shot if you see potential and possibility to actually do it. If for instance, you have an idea for a specific thing that you would make sense to productize.
Yeah,
it might be doable. You can drop me a message on LinkedIn and we can discuss that privately if you want to. But generally, I would agree to try it out. I usually do these sorts of things for customers when they, for a specific customer on a case-to-case basis. I don't just publish them as products myself because I did not, really come up with an idea for a great product yet. If I do come up, if I do find one, I might try to, but I haven't yet.
And that's why we are great. We are working with great tools like Power Platform. But I think that I think that I take it at the time of the event. Agnius, maybe we'll switch to the conversation private on the LinkedIn, and we will leave in here Michael to give him a microphone back. Maybe. Yeah. What do you think?
Thanks.
Yeah, it was a great session, Agnius, and I think in respect of time, we should wrap up, unless someone would jump out with a question, interesting one. But if not, applause and great feedback you had. And I think you should continue this session to provide this session on different other conferences, because on our little community of Power Platform geeks, it might not be, especially for those ones who are starting the journey and there are no experience in HTML or web application designers, they might learn a lot, and there's a lot more. Yeah, at Scottish Summit. you can try it out.
Just a quick thing. If anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, you can scan this QR code and find, or just find me by my name anyway. I'll happily accept your connection request. And I will actually keep delivering this session. I will actually deliver this one in Hamburg in a few hours as well. So that's also a thing. But anyway, thank you all of you, and sorry for the connectivity issues previously, and have a great rest of the day with the other sessions.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.